Hey. So here we are. I wanted to give you some information on security. Today we talk about security. And we've been seeing more and more attacks every day. More evil lurks in the world out there. And we're going to talk about the layer 2 security and what makes it different than some of the other layers and some of the mitigation tactics that are out there. So let's talk about it. So what we have in terms of our Cisco knowledge base is a couple of things. One is this idea of an endpoint. What is an endpoint? An endpoint is any device that actually connects to the network at an access level. So if you think about the idea of access, you have both the access and you have trunks. And so when you have a trunk, you have a port that can send and receive multiple types of traffic in terms of tagging, right? So it's totally open and available. I can tag any VLAN traffic that comes through on that trunk that I have specified that trunk port is allowed to send. But so what that does is it actually creates a potential security risk if I were able to actually fool that switch into thinking that I was actually part of the trunk. I could see some of the traffic that's sent over it. So we have to look at our switch configuration, make sure that things are not misconfigured. So part of it is in terms of layer 2 security is actually that physical layer that we think about, and the physical layer comes in to all kinds of devices. That physical layer is there. Um, it corresponds to today not just PCs, but you have your mobile devices, you have wireless hubs that extend the physical layer out. So you got to really think about what we're doing in our networks, and that's why physical access is an important part. Um, so we're going to look at some functions of network attacks, and going to kind of put that up here. And okay, so notice that you have different kinds of attacks. DDoS. This is something you hear often, and DDoS attacks have only grown in the current world. The bandwidth that I'm able to basically hijack with a distributed denial of service attack is getting larger and larger with the amount of bandwidth that's out there on the network. I don't want to. I hesitate to quote, current trends, but I mean the amount of terabits of data that's out there that can be hijacked at once. And here's kind of the way that works: is these endpoints, right, called zombies. It could be any device. It could be some device that's compromised in some way. So that's why people would go out, and the idea is let's build viruses, let's build security tools that will basically bypass or use some vulnerability, right, to get into a network or host, and I want to basically capture as many hosts as I can. And the idea is that the more distributed my endpoints are around the world, the less I will be able to, a security team would be able to track and stop these distributed denial of service attacks. And then we have the data breaches. These are where I will have an actual person who wants to get in my network. They want to get into my data. They want to steal something. The idea is exfiltration, right? An exfiltration is when I take data and I take it back out of the network. And then malware. Most of the time that comes as ransomware, where I want to basically take some device and encrypt it, corrupt it, do something to it to force someone to basically pay me a ransom, right? So that's the idea. If I can maybe even fool someone into thinking that their data is compromised. Of course, the way that this works today is it's organized crime of the 21st century. These are the organized crime bosses that are out there, and so they're out there running operations, entire operations that are looking to infect as many endpoints as possible with malware. And so how do we protect against that? And so there's all kinds of products, services, things like firewalls and VPNs, right? You've heard all these types of things, web security appliances, email scrubbers, right? They're all out there, and it's every single layer of the network that they're going to go in. To every point, we try to protect against some component of bad access. The issue is that, if I could take my network offline and, go through and check everything and make sure it's safe. The problem is I can't take it offline, right? I am in a network. It needs to be completely online all the time. It needs to be available, right? And that's where that availability comes in. So, what are our endpoints? Right? These are, maybe they were computers at one time, desktops. Then they became desktops and laptops. Now they're mobile phones. Now you can bring your mobile phones into the network. The people bring their phones from home, hook up to the Wi-Fi. It's absolutely can be the Wild West in a network, and so we have to do what we can to control physical access to the network. All right, so we start to put layer 7 devices in, and sometimes we forget about regular old switch. And so what we're going to do is kind of look at some things here for this. This is another example. The email security appliance is another example of an email and web, right? These are our layer 7. These are our high level devices that come in. We're going to go and actually scan email that comes in, right? Email is the number one way or attack vector that a person can get into a network, because what do I have to do with that? If I get an email that comes in, all I have to do is get someone to click one thing. And as we talk about in network security and some other classes, there are all kinds of ways to hide those links. what you may not realize is that when a person is using a web browser, the JavaScript that is embedded in the browser actually has the ability to report on any type of activity that's going on inside that browser window. I can tell if I were watching the communication between the browser and the person. I could see what button they clicked on, whether their mouse button was up or down, whether they were moving the mouse right or left, the position it was on the screen, the velocity it's moving. I could even have I could even tie in, for instance, to some artificial intelligence tool, and it could tell me whether or not the person on the other end of that was more than likely a human versus a script-enabled device, right? So there's one of the things that is important to think about in terms of when we start looking at networking is we remember that we're building and designing networks that are in a sense alive. So in that sense, they're always uh, transmitting data that could uh, be very be changing on an hour to hour, minute to minute basis, right, as my users utilize data. So we have to have things set up on the network so that they are responsive. And so anyway, the if I have a web site, right, and I'm looking at a web page, and what's really going on in between my browser and my user is that there is absolutely some communication that occurs, and the idea of the hacker or the bot or some other nefarious, right, person could get in there and actually see that communication just by installing what's called a hook into my browser. And the way that that hook gets installed, 99% of the time, maybe 98% of the time, is that the user gets tricked in doing it. Because while I could go through and I could actually seek out users and hunt for vulnerabilities in their network, that's time consuming. So it's much easier to send out a broadcast email and which you have probably seen, and actually trick as many people as possible. And so the low hanging fruit, right? These are the people that fall for the trick. They click on a link. Oh, it didn't do anything, right? When I clicked on that link, it didn't do anything. That was an error. It must have been a glitch. Right? How many times have you said that to yourself? It must have been a glitch. Right? And so, um, but there's a good chance that it wasn't a glitch. Some software was installed. Right? One notorious issue or situation was a Flash. When browsers used Flash, it was notorious that there would be an automatic update. You would get a pop-up that said your Flash is out of date. You need to click here to install the latest Flash player. Right? Now, sometimes that could be a valid event. Other times, it was absolutely not a valid event. And so all it took was that one notice that I clicked yes to that allowed a hacker to get in, exploit the vulnerability in my system, and then either maybe they installed a hook in my web browser, maybe that was actually my authorization to accept a security certificate. Tons of issues, right, that could happen there if I could just trick my user, right? And so that's where the security appliance came in, is if I can just have another device out there that will scan emails, right? Can I scan emails and prevent my user from using or falling victim to a trick, right? So always what we do when we have these solutions in place, like email security appliance or web security appliances, right? These are filters for websites. We use things like DNS to basically filter the URL requests, right? And it scans for malware. There's lots of things that can happen. A web security appliance will act as a middleman. It will take my SSL encrypted website and it will decrypt it. It will probably send it over to a log or a SIEM system, and it will filter it, make sure there's nothing bad in the code on the website, right? There's lots of things I can do with WSAs. So those are types of things that we can do with our system. Access control is another point, right? We have to know what users are able to access, what their grants are, what their privileges are. We have to know who they are, if they have credentials. All right, and so how do we do that on a switch? Right, we can use a local password, right? And you have probably set one of these up in your lab at this point. But if I'm using the line, right, I get the password command here, and I can put in whatever I want. Now, obviously, if I use set service password encryption, I'm going to encrypt that, so I won't be able to see it in the configs. But one of the drawbacks on this type of access control is that it doesn't allow me any freedom in where I actually obtain the information or where the credentials are stored. They're stored on the switch. So we don't necessarily want the credentials to be stored on each switch, right? See, it says here that the user accounts configured locally is not scalable, and no fallback authentication method. Now, what does that mean when we talk about a fallback authentication method, right? So let's just say that I have stored a password locally in a switch, but I also have that password stored globally somewhere in a database, some type of server. So let's just say that I go and that server enforces some type of policy for me to change my password, and so I go change my password, but the script there is no script that actually goes out and updates the switch configuration. And so 6 months later, a year later goes by, and I need to get in that switch to do something, to change a setting, change a port, change something very minor, and I can't get in. I'm trying to log in. I can't get in because I had my local password set on that switch. There was no AAA server or authentication server set up to deal with that login, and so it becomes the problem of, well, I've got to what we would say in industry is we've got to roll a truck, right? That means that we have got to either get in the vehicle and go out somewhere, or we've got to call somebody and get them to physically go plug in the console cable. Now, there's other ways to mitigate that type of thing, right? So I could have a console server plugged into my rack, and I could have a cable plugged into the console port of each device, And that's generally how it's done. You have a console server with a special VLAN access. You may have some type of out-of-band login on this switch. But the point is that no matter what, it's not when it's not scalable. It just means it's not functional in terms of when I use this local login. So maybe it works for a network of 2 to 3 switches. But normally, not a good thing. Okay, so here's our authentication, authorization, and accounting. This type of service or component is the modern way to actually communicate, and we generally use server-based AAA authentication, right? And so the idea here in authentication is I make sure my user is who they say they are, right? I make sure that a person who has a credential, right, can authenticate with it. That means they have both a username and a password, right? And even today, you know that it could be a some type of token that you validate with, right? It doesn't have to be a password. It could be a token or some other tool, one-time pad, a one-time password, a secure ID token, a telephone, multi-factor authentication. You can do text message, right? There's lots of different ways to use an access token, and that would never really be able to happen on a local device. It would need to have a server, right, that authenticates some type of success that this person is successfully authenticated, right? And so once that happens, then we move on to authorization. So the idea behind authorization is this user authorized? Right. So once we've determined our identity, now we look at, are we able to access what we want? Right. And then the third thing is accounting. Right. So this is my logging. This is my event monitoring system. I want to make sure in accounting that I know exactly what happened. What did my user try to do? What did they access? What was the result? Right? So did they try to elevate their privileges? Were they given access or granted access to this? This is where my logging comes in. In certain applications, an example of maybe a AAA server would be to authenticate. Perhaps you had users that were using a paid-for hotspot service. So I had lots and lots of users logging on, logging off. Right, they're going in and out, trying to access the internet. Maybe they do that over the course of a 24, 48-hour period, or 2 weeks, or a month. And we want to set some limits on those users. Hey, you can only transfer this much data before you hit an upgrade wall, right, a paywall, or before your billing system changes your rate. And so I need to figure out a way to log that. And so that's one example of what AAA could be used for. Now, another example of that is, let's just say that I had that system set up and I had all these users that were able to log on to the internet, right, to get through my paywall, right, and actually utilize their service. And if I kept track of some counters, right, basically at the start of a period, maybe midnight, I said, well, how many bytes has this user transferred? Right, so we'll start at 0, and then they log on at 5 a.m. Okay, and maybe every hour I have a byte counter, right, that I'm tracking every hour, right? So 5 a.m. they log on and then they download an update on their iPhone. So maybe that's 500 megabytes, right? So now and I did a little browsing, right? So maybe I got 500 to 600 megabytes, and now it's 6 o'clock, right? So I capture that data point. Now between 6 and 7, I do a little Netflix streaming on my data. Maybe I transfer 2 gigs, right, between my or maybe 1 gig between 6 and 7, and 1 gig between 7 and 8. All right, so I keep those counters, and all I have to do potentially is keep the one counter of how many bytes did I transfer in that hour. Right? Maybe I want to go ahead and track it every 5 minutes of that hour. So now I have 20 data points, right, that I can keep track of, right, for that user. And it's just numbers, right? I'm just keeping track of numbers of what were the bit values, right, that user had. How many bytes or bits did they transfer? Probably bytes. And the good part about that is it's accounting, right? So all I have to do if I want to see a graph of my user's access is figure out how many bytes they used every hour. Right? So now I have a historical total of that user's usage. Now, if I wanted to look and see how, on the whole, how much did my whole hotspot use, I could just take all the users that logged in on that particular device from my accounting log and add up all of the values for every hour or every 5 minutes, right? And I get an idea. Now I could also see, using that very same information, of all the data that was transferred, who used the most. All right, so it could be this idea of I could find out that this one person used 85% of my bandwidth, right, on that network. If those things were important to me, and a lot of times they are, those are some of the tools that AAA will allow me to capture. Those are some of the things that it will allow me to do, is I can send that data over to a database. And all that it's really doing is it's monitoring an interface and an IP address for some byte value. So when we start to add up these little things that can happen, we end up with some pretty powerful tools. Okay, so we're going to talk about layer 2 security threats, and I want to show you a slide there. Now, layer 2 is different than higher layers, obviously. Remember what we don't have on layer 2. We don't have things like time to live, right? There's no IP addresses at layer 2, right? It's only MACs. It's only MAC addresses that we have there. So we have a different, essentially a different security paradigm here at layer 2. At layer 3, we can do filtering based on IP addresses, sources, destinations. At layer 4, we can do filtering based on port numbers and based on transport protocols. Up at the session layer, we have security that's based on credentialing, such as SSL certificates, and whether or not those certificates are issued by valid certificate authorities. Have user permissions that are built in there, and so there's security at every layer, and even layer 2, right? This is where we get to that different. It's just a different paradigm. How does that security work? And so mainly, we got to remember that layer 2 wholly encompasses the physical layer in it. And so a lot of our layer 2 is going to be based on what happens physically. Okay. So these types of things are things that these are different types of attacks that are specific to layer 2. MAC addresses. This is a common one that can happen by software, and it can. Interesting thing about a MAC table attack or MAC address attack is that it can happen just as frequently to some error condition that happens as it can with a piece of malware. But the idea is that my MAC address or CAM table on the switch is only so big. Once that particular table gets full of bogus entries, then my switch becomes basically a hub at that point. So there are things that are made to prevent that, and we'll look at that. VLAN attacks, I could actually use an attack called double tagging, where I can put a VLAN tag inside of a packet and use trunking to fool the switch. DHCP, I can actually spoof a DHCP server. ARP poisoning is close in a way to MAC table attacks. I can put false ARP entries into a switch, and then STP or spanning tree attacks is where I could fool my spanning tree protocol into thinking that my switch that I'm connected to or my device was actually a root bridge or some other way to do it. So these are all physical. Now, a lot of times I gotta have physical access to my network, right, in order to do these things. So I gotta have a device that's plugged in. I gotta have a device that's configured and connected somehow to my network. So that is why many of the mitigations that we'll see actually are done on the switch, right? So I can turn some different things on, like port security, right? Maybe I want to shut that port down if I put some unknown device on it. Maybe I want to shut it down. Add DHCP snooping, right? I'm going to limit how many DHCP requests I can use on that port. So there are definitely things that we can do, and these are one thing to think about in terms of these mitigations is that they are micro services on the actual switch itself. So IP source guard, right? I'm gonna make sure that I don't have some unknown IP address, right, that comes through my switch. These are microservices that happen. So it's all about how I take my switch and I begin to layer on, little by little, operational parameters that change the way it works. And these are important features, and they weren't always there. And so obviously you had a time when the network was a much simpler network, and it was just the switch was just there to send data and to put a multi-access LAN in place. And that has so changed in the way we have done our switches. So we will get into another video of the actual attacks on the switches after this. This is just an overview of security. I want to highlight some important points of each one of these tools going through. But check out the next broadcast for more information on switching. So I want to thank you for your time today. We'll see you in the future.